Hey, what's going on everybody? I hope you are well. It's been a little while since we talked about espresso on this channel. I've done lots of dial-in videos with specific coffees, but I wanted to take some time today and talk about my methodology for building up an espresso recipe. The goal is to get you set up to make a recipe that is both delicious and consistent. So today we're going to talk about bar setup, coffee selection, building that recipe, and making basic adjustments. And for this video, I'm going to leave out pre-infusion, WDT, and some other techniques and just keep things really nice and simple. The goal is to get into tasting and building a recipe right away. So to me, there's a pretty clear sequence to follow for great tasting espresso. The first thing is consistency. So machines are obviously very consistent. Grinders are consistent, machines are consistent, to a point of course with varying levels throughout the range of what's available out there. But compared to humans, they're very consistent. Humans are not consistent really at all, at least when you try to do something very precise. And generally this is a good thing. This is what makes life interesting. But when you are trying to be really precise with speedrunning perhaps, or with making espresso, there is not really a whole lot of room for error. So the more consistent you can be behind the bar, the better. To start out, I like to set up my bar the same way every time. So everything is within arm's reach, everything's clearly visible and clean. I have my scale out, I've got a milk pitcher out if I need it. I have 2 rags, one for espresso and one for milk. And anything else that you'd like to have on your bar, just make sure it's in the same place every time and it's ready to go. Another thing to consider is preheating your machine. Most home machines take about 15 to 30 minutes to warm up, so don't skip that step and be consistent about it. You don't want your machine to be hotter one moment to the next. So if you start dialing in when your machine has just come up to pressure versus 10 or 15 minutes later, it's gonna be slightly different. Not a huge deal, but something to consider and something that I definitely like to keep consistent when I'm making espresso at home. And of course, keeping your espresso machine and your grinder nice and clean. Cleaning out the burrs regularly, back flushing regularly, and especially if you have a water tank on your machine, washing that out and making sure it has fresh filtered water before you start. Super important and will have a huge, absolutely huge impact on your espresso. So all those things are things to consider before you even start making espresso. Starting these habits of consistency early on so that you can carry them throughout everything that you do on bar. So now it's time to pick out a good coffee for espresso. This step can be a little bit daunting, especially if you're going to a market that has a pretty good selection for coffee. Ideally, the easiest way to do this is to go to a good coffee shop or a good roaster, somebody who roasts their own coffee in town. Talk to them about what they like, what is tasting really good on espresso at the moment, and they will definitely give you some good guidance, both what they're into and what might taste really good on a home machine. And if that isn't an option for you and you're just relying on coffee labels, that's totally okay. What I like to do in that situation is kind of make the distinction between 2 different options. So I will look for either a espresso blend or just a coffee blend in general, or a single origin. Blends tend to be a little bit more reliable and forgiving, especially when being made as espresso. They are also really good for beginners, or if you are looking for a classic flavor profile, classic kind of Italian flavor profile. Also for cappuccinos, lattes, you almost can't go wrong with a blend. Single origin coffees, on the other hand, have a pretty diverse flavor profile, ranging from deep, rich chocolate and cherry to lemons, blueberries, all sorts of stuff. So if you're feeling more adventurous, you're more of a straight shot drinker, Americano drinker, then these coffees can be extremely rewarding. Okay, so now with that out of the way, it's time to build our recipe. So dose, yield, and time are the 3 variables that we will be dealing with to build up our recipe. There are a couple other things that we can talk about later on. Maybe I'll make a part 2 in the future, but to make consistently good espresso, these are the 3 concepts that you need to understand. So when it comes to dose, basically the amount of coffee that you want to make is the amount of coffee that you should dose, but there's a couple little restrictions that you can keep in mind. For one is your basket size. So sometimes baskets are marked. These are marked. This one's a 20 gram VST basket. This is a 17 gram La Marzocco basket. In this case, I would do plus or minus 1 gram. So anywhere between 19 to 21 for this guy, and anywhere between 16 to 18 for this one. If your basket is not marked, don't worry. Take your tamper, and you only want to tamp as far as this piston goes. So essentially when there's coffee in the basket, you want to see it, the top of the piston being flush with the top of the basket. That will ensure that there's enough headspace, enough room for the coffee to move around in the basket while it's brewing. You don't want to see it be up like this or conversely like too far down into the basket, because that will create issues, and we don't like to have issues. No, this video is not about issues. This video is about getting rid of issues. Ha. So of course we're weighing our coffee input. We're also going to weigh our espresso output. So weighing the yield is a consistent way to keep your recipe in line. I like to do 1 part coffee to 2 parts water to start, so a 1-to-2 ratio for short. I find that most coffees taste really good as espresso this way. There's a couple situations we'll talk about later where you may want to adjust that, but start out with a 1-to-2 and you should be good to go. The third variable is extraction time. As soon as your pump kicks on, start your timer. Even though you can't see it, water is hitting your coffee and the extraction has begun. So sometimes I do see people talking about starting the timer when you see drips coming out of the portafilter, and that is just not as accurate. So you want to know the entire extraction time from the time that the pump kicks on to the time that it stops. If you start when you see coffee coming out of the portafilter, it could have been up there for 5 to 10 seconds, and you really need to measure everything. As far as the extraction time goes, it's kind of hard to nail down an extraction time to recommend to everybody, but considering the fact that you have a medium, maybe medium light espresso, the espresso has had plenty of time to rest. So for me, I like 10 to 20 days before I start making coffee. Sometimes with roasters, it's hard to find coffee that has been sitting on the shelf that long. Sometimes with cafes, it's a little bit easier, but even up to like 5 days is okay. But let's say that's between that 10 to 20 day window, and it's a medium to light roasted coffee. Somewhere between 20 to 30 seconds will probably be just fine. If it's a really light coffee or a single origin, you might want to go a little bit longer because it's a little bit more dense, a little bit more hard to extract. And if it's a darker coffee, then you might want to be closer to that 20-second mark. If you're not sure about any of those variables at all, that's okay. Look for a steady stream that is sort of like dark honey dripping out of the basket. It should start within 5 to 10 seconds. Start coming out of the basket, I mean, within 5 to 10 seconds. And it should continue to increase in speed without getting too sputtery. And it's okay if it's quite fast by the end. So again, for most coffees, you're looking somewhere between 20 to 30 seconds. Okay, so now we've set up our bar, we've selected our coffee, and we have built up a recipe. Now it's time to taste it and start making some adjustments if we need to. So at this point, I really just want to worry about the grinder as far as making adjustments go. There tends to be a pretty small window, maybe between 2 or 3 seconds, so a couple of different extractions you can get, from really under-extracted to over-extracted. Somewhere in the middle, there are a few extractions that are going to be really tasty. And I don't want to mess with the ratio because first I want to find that window, taste that coffee, and see how I like it before I make any major changes. And a side note, it really helps to taste the coffee when it is hot. Swirl it around a little bit, or maybe even stir it with a spoon. Taste it when it's warm and even lukewarm before you make any huge adjustments. So if your tasting in the coffee is sour, weak, a little bit watery, you probably need to grind a bit finer. Grinding finer will extract more and also slightly raise the strength of the coffee. If you go too fine, you'll end up with something that is bitter, salty, and intense. On the other hand, if you are experiencing a coffee that does taste like that, maybe even tastes like soy sauce, which is something that I taste often in coffees that's really, really over-extracted, then you're gonna want to grind coarser. As you get coarser and coarser, the coffee strength will lessen and the extraction will lessen. And sometimes you get into this sort of like weak espresso that is still kind of pleasant, not really offensive in any way. So personally for me, what I like to do is if I'm kind of in that zone where I'm not really sure, I'll just go finer, finer, finer in like little minute adjustments until I hit that really bitter wall and then back it up. Going through that process will probably get me into that window that I talked about of maybe 1 or 2 extractions that taste really nice. Okay, so then what to do if you find that window and you find that you really don't like the coffee that you're tasting? Well, first, I like to do a quick reality check. Is this coffee the coffee that I'm imagining in my head, or is it the coffee that is actually in the grinder? Are those two things different? One way you can tell, if you want to be really thorough, this is a nice exercise to do, is to brew that as a drip coffee or perhaps even cup it and see what kind of flavors come out at you that way. You might confirm what you were already expecting, or you might be pleasantly surprised or maybe unpleasantly surprised by something that's totally different. Either way, it's a great exercise to do, and if you've never done it before, I highly encourage it. Okay, so after you've passed the reality check, then you can adjust the ratio. Try adjusting the ratio either up or down. So say that you're starting with a coffee that was 20 grams in, 40 grams out for simplicity. So you could adjust that 40 gram yield to a 50 gram yield. What that's gonna do is increase the extraction a little bit, but also make the coffee a little bit weaker. So not quite as strong of a coffee. So you will be sacrificing some brew strength, but gaining clarity of flavor. This can help when the coffee is tasting a little bit intense, it's tasting overly acidic, and it doesn't really have that balance. Whichever direction you go, balance is the key. So if you take that 40 gram yield and decrease it to 30 grams, then you're gonna substantially increase the brew strength of your coffee. You might lower the extraction a little bit. So if it's tasting really intense, if it's tasting a little bit too, sometimes it can be tasting too acidic as well. If it's tasting too bitter, this might be helpful for you. I find that this approach works better if your coffee has low acidity to begin with. So if you're looking for more of an Italian profile, this will definitely be helpful, or if you're looking for something that just is like a little bit more punchy in flavor, but doesn't have that over-the-top screaming acidity that some single origins do. All right, so I feel like this is a great place to start, whether you're first learning to make espresso, or if you're thinking about branching out and trying some more single origins or some coffees that you just aren't quite as familiar with. The key again is to be consistent. Practice a lot, taste lots of coffees, get a feel for what you like, and become more comfortable with what kind of adjustments you can make on your machine and to your recipe. There are certainly way more variables out there to explore, and again, I might do a part 2 video to kind of highlight the techniques that I think are really good to add to this. But for right now, especially if you're just starting, this is great. You don't want to make it too complicated and too overburdensome that you don't want to make coffee anymore. The last thing you want to do is have a giant paperweight on your counter that you spent anywhere from $500 to a couple grand on. The whole point is to make something delicious and to enjoy doing it. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope it helped you gain a little bit more insight into how to build an espresso recipe or how to improve perhaps the recipe that you already have. If you have any questions or comments, please go ahead, leave them down below, and I'll see you very soon in the next one. Take care.